And welcome everybody to our 226th episode of the Minnesota Outdoor Skills and Stewardship Series. We're talking about trail cameras today, and this is kind of a timely topic because it is getting into hunting season. It finally feels like fall around here in Minnesota this week. So we are joined with John Erb. He's one of our fur bearer research biologists, and he's been using trail cameras and doing research with them for quite a few years and has some great tips to share with us. So John, I think I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Benji, and welcome to everybody who tuned in today. As Benji said, my name is John Erb. I'm the fur bear and wolf research biologist for the DNR in Grand Rapids. Have used trail cameras on a lot of research projects and monitoring things we do. I'm not going to claim to be any kind of an expert or an engineer who's great with understanding all the technology, but have learned quite a few things over the years of using them. So hopefully I can pass a few things on to some of you that will help you get into or improve your use of trail cameras for looking at wildlife or other things in nature. One of the first things you have to consider when you're using trail cameras is, what do you want to monitor? It's nice to think that there's sort of a one size fits all, that you can give a recommendation that's good for all wildlife or other things you want to monitor. But like most things, one size fits all sometimes results in you getting a lot of average stuff for many things. So it is important to consider what really is most important to you when it comes to using trail cameras for monitoring wildlife. This is just a slide that shows many of the species that I have to try and work with, monitor. One size fits all is probably not going to work here. Trying to detect weasels is not the same as trying to detect bears. And I may have to stop that. It is advancing on its own. So I thought I had fixed that. So apologize if I have to go back a time or two. So again, what you really need to think about first is, what are your goals? So you're just doing this for fun, just see what's out there, get a few pictures? Or are you trying to get a little more formal and want to monitor? From year to year, am I getting more pictures of deer, bobcats? Then you have to start thinking about standardizing, where you put them, what months you put them out, how many days you're, comparing each year. So your goals really matter. Your budget will influence the cameras that you want to buy. Obviously, we all want to have the best of the best, but it's not always possible. So that's going to play a role in which camera you may want to purchase. And of course, the species of interest. Some species are slow moving, some are fast moving, some mill around, some don't. Large bodied, small bodied. So these things can influence which is going to be the best camera. You also need to think about whether it's important for you to try and get those images immediately. Do you want to know right away that there's a family of bobcats that are out in front of your camera? Or is it fine to know 2 weeks later when you check the SD card? If you want to know right away, you're pretty much going to have to use cellular cameras. And we'll talk more about these in a minute. If you're fine waiting, then a lot of the store on board cameras that have images on the SD card that you look at later are fine as well. Also have to think about theft risk. You can, in many areas, not all, but in many areas of public land, you can put a camera, but it may be more prone to theft. So if you're going to be doing that, you need to think about, do you want to put a real expensive camera on some place on public land where it's more prone to be stolen? So these are just a few of the things you'll want to think about when you're deciding which trail camera is going to be best for your interest. How they operate, I think, again, I'm not an engineer. I don't think for many pieces of technology we use that we do need to understand all the details. Most of us use our cell phones and probably don't understand a whole lot of the things that are underneath the screen that make it work. But in this case, I do think there's a few things that are important to try and understand. One is how they trigger. Most of these trail cameras, the trigger mechanisms operate off passive infrared sensors, similar to a lot of motion detectors you may have, say, on your garage. And what they're doing is monitoring the environment for infrared radiation, which can be thought of as heat and then moving heat. So it's something that's moving, that's warm. So it's looking to detect that. Pretty much all trail cameras have those passive infrared sensors. However, you can also program cameras to take photos on time lapse. So whether an animal walks in front of it or not, maybe you want to take a picture of a open field. Say you're looking to see how many deer are out in the field at dusk. So you could program the camera to take a picture every single day at, say, 7 o'clock at night. You can do those along with the passive infrared, but time lapse can be a very useful programming option to use depending upon your goals as well. And then there are also cameras, these cellular cameras that allow you to do some on-demand or even live streaming. So you may be sitting in your house and just say, oh, I want to take a picture now just to see what's there. So you can do an on-demand trigger. And some of them allow you to actually live stream to see what's there, not in more of a video kind of on demand. These cameras can drain more battery life, and the videos coming in may not always be as good, but it does give you that instantaneous, I want to see now. These pictures at the bottom kind of illustrate, a infrared type of image that you might be, or that the camera's trying to monitor. There's a couple things I want to say about that. One is, you'll notice on this right one, this is a short video clip I'll play, and you can see these sensors are detecting motion. But importantly, notice that it's not just detecting the motion of the animal, but when the animal's moving, or if wind was doing, you see the branches moving. So understand that it doesn't know whether it's an animal or something else. What it notices is that there's heat moving. The other thing that I'll show on the next slide is that cameras are not typically getting a continuous image. They're not sensing this in a continuous thing like the deer photo would show. Instead, they're sensing heat and motion in narrow bands out in front of the camera. It would take a lot more energy and battery drain and technology to get a continuous image like we're seeing here. So the sensor is always monitoring the environment in front of it. What's true of most cameras is that the area that the sensor is monitoring, so in that top center photo, it'd be the orange cone area, it is often larger than the actual field of view of the camera. So the camera, if it's triggered, it might just take a picture of what's in the blue area, but anything in the orange area could trigger it. So it's possible as an animal's coming in, the camera may be triggered, take pictures, and you don't even see the animal. If it turns around and goes the other way, that can explain some false triggers where you get pictures, there's nothing in it, but there clearly wasn't wind blowing leaves or anything else that triggered it. So it might have been an animal out on the edge of the field of view of the camera itself. In the bottom right, it illustrates a little more detail of how a camera really is seeing the environment. Instead of it being a continuous image like I mentioned before, it has a couple sensors that are monitoring bands of the infrared area in front. So these two sensors, these pairs of sensors are looking at whether or not the heat signature, the infrared radiation coming in, whether there's a rapid change between those two bands. Okay, if it knows what the background is, and now an animal like animal number one walks in, first hits the left sensor, and that causes more of a differential between the two sensors, and that's what it detects and then causes the camera to trigger. So an animal one might trigger it, animal three might trigger it. Animal two might be coming straight towards the camera or in one of these dead zones on the camera and actually not trigger it. Obviously, once it gets in there, it's going to turn probably and move. So most likely you would detect all of these animals, but just be aware that it's not detecting a continuous area in front of you, but rather a multiple pairs of bands that array that goes out in front of the camera. The other thing the bottom left photo shows is that sometimes animals that are coming across the field of view at an angle can actually intersect more of those bands. So there can be more opportunity for it to trigger the camera if it's coming across at an angle. If that line were drawn straight horizontal across there, it might only be intersecting 3 of those bands. Whereas an animal coming at a 45-degree angle would maybe have 4 opportunities to trigger the camera. This is not always that important, but it can be in certain situations, say a fast moving animal. And I'll come back to this in a minute. Some other considerations when you're putting cameras out, what to think about. Attaching it to a weak object like a very thin tree, a 2-inch diameter tree, which is going to blow in the wind, is now going to cause the camera to move. So it doesn't realize it's moving. All it knows is it's sensing that there's changes in the background, moving heat. So that can create a lot of false triggers. So you generally want to attach your camera to a fairly solid object that's not going to be blowing in the wind itself. The other thing is that smaller animals generally have to be closer to the camera to trigger it. They are going to have less infrared radiation reaching the camera. So a big deer could be farther out and still trigger the camera. A small mouse like you see climbing that tree would need to be closer before it would trigger the camera. So if you're looking to monitor little weasels or big deer, this can influence how you might want to program your camera as far as the sensitivity. Cold seasons, when it's cold outside, also create more differential with the animal. If the animal's 100 degrees body, external body temperature or 90 degrees, and the air temperature is 10 below, it's going to be very reliable at detecting that animal and triggering. Whereas if it's 100 degrees outside and the animal's 100 degrees, it's going to be less apt to be triggered by the animal. Moving, as I mentioned in that earlier video, moving heated vegetation can cause false triggers. So can just the sun rays coming through a forest when there's no canopy, maybe before leaf out. These sun rays and shadows moving across the forest can create false triggers. So these are things you need to just be aware of and think about. False triggers don't necessarily cause a big problem. You'll still get pictures of the animals, but it can lead to a lot of noise. You got to sort through a lot of extra pictures to go through. And most cameras do allow you to adjust the sensitivity. So if you're looking to detect small animals or animals at greater distance or in hot weather, you might want to have the camera set for higher sensitivity. Once they trigger, during the daytime, of course, they take nice color photos, but at night, they see also through the use of infrared, but it's more active. So instead of just reading the infrared radiation that's coming into the camera to trigger it, to see at night, it actually sends out more of an active infrared. We'll call it a flash, but it's generally not visible to the human eye. But cameras come in different specifications. So some cameras you'll see have what they call a red or low glow infrared flash. It's actually somewhat visible to humans or animals. It's pretty faint. You can see that camera in the bottom right. You can see all those sensors kicking on, the little red glow. You're not going to see that a lot from a long distance, but in general, it's right on the edge of the visible spectrum to us. So us and many animals will see that. It's not a white flash like camera. It's not going to be a big disturbance, but there are many animals that will spook from that. So you need to consider it. The positive of that is that usually get better images at night, more detailed, brighter, and that red low glow flash will often reach further out. Conversely, a no glow flash, it's just in a different wavelength, but it is more invisible to animals and humans. It's kind of the pros and cons are kind of the reverse. You won't get quite as sharp and bright and detailed of images at night. Might not get quite as far out, but it's much less apt to spook animals. And so if you're trying to get pictures of wary animals and you want them to come back and get more pictures later, no glow can be a real advantage for those types of species. I don't know if there are many cameras left that would still do a white flash. Obviously, you then get color nighttime photos, but you're going to spook lots of all the animals and maybe even your neighbors with the camera flashing white all night long. And these cameras do have their own separate light meter to detect when it is night and therefore when to activate the infrared flash. This is I intended to try and make this less wordy, but I'm just going to run through it fast. how you get your images. Cameras come in 3 different options generally. Cellular, I mentioned before, so you can get your images immediately or close to that. These cameras tend to be the most expensive, but you do have to have cell coverage wherever you place the camera. And you will have to have a cell plan just like you do for your phone. Some camera companies have their own arrangements with cell plans. Others just allow you to pick whatever you want. You go into Verizon, give them the ID number for the camera, the information, and you set it up on your cell plan just like you would a phone. So there would be a monthly charge of, I'm not sure what that would be, it'd vary by company, say $10 a month per camera. You do get those rapid pictures, but when they come in through the cellular transmission, oftentimes they will be smaller pictures, sort of thumbnails, and they may be lower resolution than what's actually stored on the camera. So you'll still get the images on the camera stored there to get later, but the quick ones you get through cellular may not be quite as good a resolution. It does also allow you to reprogram the camera. So we talked a little bit about sensitivity. There may be times of the year you want to change it without walking out to the camera. So you can remotely reprogram it and say have higher sensitivity or lower. These cameras will often drain batteries faster, but many of these cameras have options to attach solar panels to them to recharge batteries. But it's generally, they're still going to work for a long time, so you don't have to visit the camera too often. I would just note you also need to be very careful if you're thinking of using these cellular cameras in any type of hunting situation. That may not be legal to get a picture of an animal, a deer coming down a trail, and then to go run out to your tree stand. I'm not with enforcement. As I understand it, that would not be legal. Right now, it would be considered the use of radio equipment to transmit information to assist in the take. So certainly be aware of legality if you're going to be using these in any type of hunting situation. Contact your local officers. Some cameras will use Wi-Fi or Bluetooth, so there's no cell coverage or plan needed. It allows you to remotely get the pictures, but you still have to get, say, within 50 feet, 100 feet. But it may keep you from having to go up to the camera, touch it, turn it off, disturb it, and just be able to go up there with your phone and download the pictures. So I don't see as much use of those, but it is an option that can be very useful in certain situations. And then most cameras are manual. Nearly all cameras out there are manual or increasing number of cellular cameras. So the manual ones, you have to go to the camera, turn it off, remove the SD card, take that back to your computer. They are, generally speaking, the cheapest cameras. There's less technology that can go wrong, and the pictures are just as good. You just don't have that remote communication. So depends on your goals and needs. Another thing to be aware of is the speed of the cameras. So when a camera does trigger, there's obviously a little bit of time lapse before the camera itself then takes a picture. These are real short times, like many cameras are now sub-second. But there is a delay, a little bit of a delay from the trigger to the picture. If you're trying to get multiple pictures, then you have to consider the recovery. The camera takes a picture, but now it has to write that image to the SD card, re-ready, and take another picture. So there's this recovery time between pictures. And then SD cards themselves, have different write speeds. Some cards can write faster. So it's still going to be very fast, but for some situations, these details matter. If you're trying to get fast moving wolves coming down a trail, then going with cameras that have faster trigger recovery speeds, SD cards that have faster write speeds, this can be pretty important. For many situations, it's probably not real critical, but for some it is, and you need to be aware of those speeds. Most camera companies will report those trigger speeds and recovery speeds in their manuals or on their websites as to how fast they are. These are just a handful of other things that cameras allow you to program. Do you want it to take pictures or videos? And many of them allow some sort of a hybrid where maybe it takes an image quick, but then it will take a 5-second video. Every camera can be a little different. Obviously, videos are much funner, neater, but they're also more battery demanding, more take up more space on your SD cards. And if you've got a camera that is falsely triggering, say from some leaves you didn't trim, now you got a whole lot of 10-second videos to watch of nothing, just to see if there was by chance an animal in it. So there's some downsides to video and some upsides. You can also determine the video and image quality. What resolution do you want? 12 megapixel pictures or 24 megapixel? And with videos, you can also control the length. Do you want 2-second videos or 10-second videos? Most cameras, you can program a trigger delay. So in some situations, depending upon what you're monitoring, if it's deer that are just going to be standing in front of the camera in a field, or say you're monitoring something like a potential den that you were curious about on your property, if stuff's going to be standing in front of it a lot, you may want to use a trigger delay that says after you took a picture, wait 10 seconds before you can take another, or 5 seconds. These are usually programmable. Another feature a lot of cameras have is that when it is triggered, you can tell it to just take the one picture. Or again, if you're trying to get fast moving animals, want to make sure you get more chance to identify a species, you can program them with a multi-shot mode. So when it's triggered, it will maybe take 3 pictures, boom, boom, boom. And then at the next trigger, it'll take another 3. So again, this can be good or bad. If it's falsely triggered all the time, now you got 3 times the number of false images. But we use this a lot to help ensure we can get the best information to identify some of these animals that might be moving faster. At a den site, a slow-moving skunk down a trail, not as important. And the infrared flash itself is sometimes adjustable, where it'll draw more battery use, but you can get more range, more power if you're trying to monitor animals that might be, say, further out in the field, versus an animal that's only 10 feet in front of the camera coming down a trail you're monitoring. Best thing you can do is just experiment with your camera and play with the settings and see what works best. Excuse me here. Where's the best place to put a camera? Really depends again. Most of my slides start with, well, it depends, and that's just the way it is. So what species are you trying to monitor? Your goals? What's the overall landscape? Not just your property, but what's the lay of the land around your property? Where might animals be most apt to move? Certain parts of your property get more use by yourselves, your kids, ATVs. Are you going to use a lure or some type of an attractant? That can influence it. And again, if you have a cellular camera, you need to think about maybe you have good cell coverage at a high point on your property, but not down at a low point. But in general, good options include any type of game trails, usually deer trails, even human walking trails, if not something you're using, 10 times a day, ATV trails, farm trails on your property, any type of habitat edge or funnel. Habitat edge might be, where forest is adjacent to a hayfield, or where a stream is adjacent, comes through a forested area. These edges or funnels can be really good places to detect animals. Water sources can be very good places too. Pond edges, beaver ponds, streams, high points, low points, fence lines, maybe even just natural food sources. Maybe you got a lot of oak trees in one part with a lot of acorns that a lot of animals, bears and deer and other things like to visit as a food source. One thing to think about is when you're going to put the camera out, it's often best, not a big issue, but often best to put the camera in a light condition that you're also aiming. So to put the camera in a very shaded area, but where you're trying to monitor animals, say out in a big sunny field, that can cause some confusion for the cameras. It can influence the exposure, can even influence the passive infrared trigger sensors as to how well they work. So in this photo on the bottom right, if you're trying to monitor that open field, maybe you'd want to move the camera out a little bit towards the field into the edge of the sun. If you're trying to monitor a trail that's coming out to it in the forest, maybe move the camera back further into the shade, so more of the view is in the shaded environment. So try and keep the camera in a somewhat similar lighting environment as the area you're targeting with the images. Make sure you clear those obstructions. In this photo, you can see these oak leaves hanging into it. This caused a lot of false triggers. Even some of the taller grass stems with those bigger seed heads you can see caused false triggers. So some of these things might have been better to clear. Trim a few more branches, turn the camera angle down a little bit, remove some of those taller grass stems. Consider the seasonal changes. A good place in the spring might be totally useless in the fall or vice versa. Also consider, even if it's on your own property, think about your neighbors, putting a camera right at the property line facing your neighbor's property to see what deer are in their field. It's probably legal, but you don't want to cause neighborly disputes either. So do consider those things. And then what am I going to attach it to? The best place in the world for catching animals may not have a good attachment option unless you bring it with you. And again, for all these things, learn as you go. These are ways you can attach it. The top photo shows, I'll come back to why there's two on that in a minute, but you can, cameras often have an option to put a circular, like an adjustable bungee to attach it, or a strap. That strap is actually around the front of the camera, but we could have put that through the back. That's what came with the camera. The hole where the bungee is often actually intended as a padlock. You put a cable lock through the camera to lock it to a tree to reduce theft. But bungees, straps can attach to trees or fence posts. You can see in the bottom right, bottom center, bottom right, there's also specialty brackets that allow you to attach cameras to a fence post, to a tree that then allows you to tilt it up and down more easily. The bottom left you can see is a camera inside a metal bear box. We'll talk about bears several times, but bears are notorious for finding and disturbing cameras. And if all they do is move it, all that's lost is, you don't get some pictures. But if they bite into it and puncture holes, well, you've lost some money. So consider bear boxes. They would bolt to the tree or fence post, and would reduce the likelihood a bear could damage the camera. That top right photo is kind of a specialty design. Colleague at the University of Minnesota Duluth, Michael Joyce, is doing some work with using cameras to monitor weasels. And they're not generally real easily detectable with cameras as they're normally placed. But in this case, these are actually metal ammo boxes you might often see, military ammo boxes, where a round hole is cut in the end, a pipe is put through it to get a weasel to come in. And inside the box, that pipe has a cutout. The camera's inside the box, maybe some bait or lure. And so I'll show you a video in a minute, but this protects the camera, provides kind of a situation that weasels like to go in these narrow tunnels and, the nooks and crannies of the forest. And so they're using this as a way to try and monitor weasels. Back to bears just for a second. So we did a study a few years ago in northern Minnesota looking at a lot of carnivores, had 100 cameras in the spring and in the fall. The cameras were at the same exact spots during the spring and the fall. And this graph just shows each of these red or gray lines, horizontal bars, was a different camera. There's 100 actually in each of these graphs. And in the spring, we got 680,000 pictures. The red lines show cameras that we considered to have become inoperable for one reason or another. So in the spring, we had many more cameras become inoperable. There were several reasons, but bears were a big one. In the spring, when bears come out of hibernation, they're hungry. Bears are always curious about novel things in their environment. We had a lot of cameras turned, knocked down by bears. We were not using the bear boxes for several reasons, but you can see spring was a little more problematic with bears. Other problems that I'll touch on later include more shadow and sun concerns in the spring before leaf out, but I'll show you some slides of that in a minute. So you may want to consider those bear boxes if you have bears, and especially in the springtime. What we did on our project was used a bungee to attach it to a tree and then use that strap as a second one to try and at least reduce some disturbance. Made it harder for them to just bump it and turn it. They still messed with some, but it helped reduce some concerns. How to aim? Well, it's depends on where you're monitoring. If you're trying to monitor a big open field, keeping the camera kind of horizontal with the land will allow you to detect animals further out. If you're angled down or up a little too much, you're going to miss that outer deer or two. But in many situations, if you're monitoring a trail, we think it's best to have it pointed downward a little bit at, say, well, there's no set angle, but if you have the camera up a little higher on a tree, pointed down towards the trail you're monitoring, then the ground becomes more of the background. And you have less concerns with these blowing leaves and shadows and other stuff. So putting it up a little bit, pointing it down towards the trail, we find tends to be a little better in many situations where you're monitoring a specific spot. Keeping that camera at a little bit of an angle to the trail. I think I have a photo, I'll illustrate that more in a minute, but keeping it at an angle to the trail can allow you to get more pictures. I mentioned earlier that it's better for triggering it, but as you see in this wolf photo here in the bottom right, even if it only triggered once, you can see there were one wolf in front of the camera, but there's two wolves off to the left. Okay, if you had the camera pointed straight across the trail and they didn't trigger when two faster moving wolves came through the first, initially, this camera pointed 45 to the trail actually got a picture of those other two wolves, even if it's the wolf in front that triggered it. So you can get a better field of view of the trail you're monitoring by having it at an angle such that even if these animals don't trigger it, the first animal or the last animals might not trigger, but you can still sometimes get pictures. Facing the camera northeast to northwest is often good to avoid problems with the sun hitting the sensors and or causing whiteout when it does take a picture. Inside of a dense forest with a lot of canopy, it's not as important because the sun's not going to hit it too much wherever you point it. But in other areas, this can be more important. And be careful about putting a camera right at eye level if you're more concerned about theft, because people just see stuff easier if it's at their eye level. Putting it down lower or up higher can be good. But most cameras allow you to test, and that's the most important here. Test it. They have many of them either have a screen you can see when you're getting ready to deploy it. You put it on the tree, you look, you can see what it's seeing. You can see the landscape. You'll realize maybe you put a 5-gallon bucket out where that wolf is and make sure it's centered in the screen before you shut it and walk away. Some of them just have a red sensor that'll flash as you walk in front of the camera to tell you when it's triggering, so you know that it's triggering where you want it to trigger. So make sure you test the aiming. That's most important here. Be sure to clear the area. I won't spend any more time on it. I've already touched on this. Leaves, tall grass, seeds, heads, things like that. Focus mostly on stuff within like 15 foot of the camera and stuff that's more prone to blowing. A very rigid stick is not going to be a problem. Light branches with leaves are going to be a problem. Another thing, if you have cameras out in the spring to consider, is what's going to grow. We had a project, we deployed cameras in the spring for 6 weeks. When we put it there, the top left photo, everything was great. Even 3 weeks later, we were probably getting pictures of any animals that came through there. But 3 weeks after that, you couldn't even see what you were trying to look at because all the ferns that had grown up in front of the image. So think about that when you're deciding where to place the camera. If you're doing it in the spring, you may want to go out a couple more times just to check, every couple of weeks to see if anything's grown up and causing a lot of obstruction. Baits and lures, whole topic in itself. First thing I want to say is, especially when it comes to anything that could attract deer, be interpreted as deer feeding baiting, know the laws. A lot of areas you simply can't do this. The laws can vary whether you're in an area where there's chronic wasting disease concerns, but or anything that can attract deer, be careful. Talk to your local conservation officers about what you're doing, especially anywhere near a hunting season, but even outside of hunting seasons, baiting, feeding deer may be prohibited. But there's lots of other baits and lures you can use for, to attract the fishers or whatever animal it may be, and I'll touch on that in a second. One of the things these baits and lures do is give you more flexibility on where to put it. Instead of trying to find the perfect trail where you think all animals are going to come, you put a lure out and these animals are going to come to you. You still want to put it in what you think is a good habitat, but more flexibility. It also tends to slow animals, hold them better. You tend to get more and better pictures. Instead of one picture of a wolf racing by the camera, maybe they slow down and stop and sniff and you get 6 nice pictures. Some animals just don't use trails and edges like a lot of wildlife. Fishers and martens are a couple examples. I'll touch on that more in a second. Downsides that you can alter animal behavior, which is not something you often want to do. You can draw animals that you don't want, for example. Maybe that you put a lure out and it draws in skunks that you really don't want your dog to run into. It can just draw them from somewhere they wouldn't normally go and expose them to more risk. So animals could die because they crossed a road to come to it, or could be killed by another predator that came there where they normally wouldn't have interacted. And it can also bias your perceptions of what's there. You might think, wow, there's twice as many species A as there is species B, but that's just because species A was more attracted to a lure than species B was. But if you're going to do it, I often find that more of an olfactory, a scent lure, so not something that's going to give the animal too many rewards like a big bait would. They'll come, they'll stay for a second, but they won't stay there, live there, set up shop. They'll move on because they didn't get a real significant reward. They can certainly be entertaining. We've used lures on many studies. Top left photo show, if you can see it, it's not a great one. We were using fish oil on some of there are actually a couple different lures, but you can see a wolf rolling on the ground, his feet up in the air. Just like your dogs like to roll on smelly stuff, so do foxes and coyotes and wolves. On the top right, we've got a gray fox that after licking some fish oil decided to scent mark. On the bottom right, we've got a black bear that was having fun rubbing the tree. The bottom left is something different, a little specialty thing. I was looking at ways that you could exclude certain animals from getting into either a cage trap or some type of a trap or a bait station, something you're doing. So I wanted to keep skunks from being able to get in or squirrels from taking the bait, but let raccoons in. So you can see there's a swinging door on this, but raccoons with their hand dexterity were able to lift that wire door up and have a blast going in and getting the bait, but skunks would walk by and leave. Here's some more stuff from that weasel project or that I mentioned before. On the top 2 photos, it was a different type of setup, a suet cage with some meat bait in it and a little bottle of some fish oil. Weasel had a lot of fun. They unclimbed the tree. On the top right, we've got a fisher that was not going to be deterred by that suet cage and ripped it apart and got the bait. In the bottom left is a different way to think about an attractant. It doesn't have to be food or lures. You may have bluebird boxes, wood duck boxes. This is a study that's actually, Michael Joyce at UMD was evaluating whether fisher would use den boxes in the summer for raising young. And here you can see an interesting interaction. There's a squirrel that got in the box, and the fisher thought, hey, this might be a bed and breakfast here for me. So I don't remember the ending of that story, but boxes, other attractants can be good places to monitor. And on the bottom right is one of those weasel things I showed you before where the weasel came in that box. The PVC tube was cut out here so you could see it. The camera's inside the box. And as a weasel comes in, this is designed to help determine how big it is so we can tell if it's a long-tailed or a short-tailed weasel. So just a fun little short clip. So just an example of some specialty monitoring that can be fun. I'm probably going to need to speed up here to leave time, so I'm going to go a little faster. We did some studies and found that actually not using a lure is as good or better for many species. So we put cameras on trails, ATV trails, hunter walking trails, game trails, things like that with no lure. And then we compared it to cameras that were in the forest at more of a random location with lures. And what we found is red fox, coyote, bobcat, skunk, wolf, gray fox were all much more likely to be detected on those trail type areas, even without a lure, than they were at the lured sites. Conversely, black bears, martens, and fishers were the only three species that were more likely to be detected at those lured sites, especially martens and fishers. We know they're the types of animals that generally don't like to just run down game trails. They're more vulnerable to predation from other carnivores. It's just not their instinct to do that. They're more of a looking around the nooks and crannies of the forest type species. So they were much more likely to be detected with a lure than on these trails. And there's hundreds of lure choices. This is where you can just experiment if you want to try some. You can get stuff at the grocery store, vanilla oil, cherry oil. There are trapping supply dealers that sell lots of specialty lures. We tested just two, fish oil and something called fatty acid scent, something we use in another track survey we do for carnivores. What we found is that bobcats, raccoons, red foxes didn't matter which lure it was. They came to both equally. However, wolves, gray foxes, fishers, martens, and skunks were twice as likely to be detected at salmon oil than that fatty acid scent. Coyotes were 4 times as likely to be detected. Only black bears were a little bit more likely to be detected at that fatty acid scent. So just consider that which lure you use can have a big result too if you decide to try that. Seasonal considerations, winter can be good and bad. Some species aren't active, so you're not going to monitor bears in winter. Skunks, raccoons, less active, chipmunks, so on. Cold can affect the batteries and cameras. Getting to your camera in deep snow to check it can be problematic, but it can be good time of year to detect. It's a cold environment with a warm animal. The cameras are very sensitive, usually get detections of most animals that come through. And baits and lures can often work really good. Animals, especially in midwinter, start getting pretty hungry, not as much food in the landscape, so a little lure might work good. Spring or summer, animals may not be moving as much. Some of them are tied to their den sites. Certainly the adults will move some, but you may be less apt to detect them if they're tied down to their den sites raising young. I mentioned before this growing vegetation, the bottom right photo, that can be a headache. At the bottom left, you can see shadows before the leaf canopy comes up in the forest. If you're out in an open field, doesn't matter, but in the forest, a lot of shadows moving around before the leaf cover comes out. Those can actually trigger the camera if you don't have the sensitivity adjusted, a little less sensitive. And again, I showed you bears might be a little more of a nuisance with your cameras in the spring. Maybe use those bear boxes then for sure. But it can be a good time to be out. You get some really neat young of the year photos as they start emerging and coming out and being a little more mobile. Fall populations, these young martens on the right, while they're not mobile earlier in the summer, by fall they're all out moving around. So populations of detectable animals are at peak levels. Bottom right photo shows a good canopy cover, so more or less concerned with shading, shadows, things like that. Nice picture of a wolf in a shaded forest. There's not a lot of that new vegetation growing in the fall like there was the spring. The downsides are you can get some windy temperatures, or a lot of winds, warm temperatures, blowing leaves, falling leaves in the later fall. And then you start to get some of the same concerns like you see in the bottom left in the spring. So pros and cons to every season. I'm not going to give you too many details here, just to note that from the camera research we did, what we find is that if you want to increase your chances of detecting an animal, generally more cameras is better than more days. However, more cameras is more money. So if you want to have an 80% chance of detecting one of these carnivores, this data is based on the species I've been showing you, where you only maybe have a 1 to 3% chance of detecting them on a given day. But if that's the case, if you want an 80% chance of detecting an animal, if you have one camera, it might take anywhere from 45 to 100 days. If you have 5 cameras, it'll maybe take you 10 to 27 days to detect that animal. So all things equal, more cameras better than more days, but also more cameras is more cost. I think I'm going to look at the time here. I think I'm only got a couple slides left. This is just a note that be careful how you interpret the data from cameras. This graph shows just the number of independent detections we got of these species on one study. Most people, and myself included, would not take this data and say, oh, this means we have more black bears in that area than we do raccoons. The difference was that black bears stayed in front of that camera longer and messed around. Okay, so comparing data across species is pretty dangerous. Their behaviors are different. Their attraction to these sites or lures differs. So the cameras are best for saying, yep, I did detect a gray fox on my property or a bobcat. They can be okay for looking at the same data for the same species across years. So compare black bears this year to black bears next year. It can also be good at black bears at my east farm and black bears at my west farm at the same time of year. But comparing across species comes with a lot of questions, even comparing within species. One year there can be the same number of foxes, but you get twice as many pictures because they were more hungry, less food, and they were moving more. So be cautious about how you interpret the data. Just shows many other things we can learn. What time of the day are animals active? We see behaviors we wouldn't otherwise see. A bobcat caching a deer that somebody, a roadkill deer, or maybe it was a hunter wounded deer that died and somebody found it, put a camera at. Lots of things we can learn from cameras, and only your imagination limits it. You can figure out what bird seeds attract the most diverse bird species at your feeder, what's digging under your shed, what bees and hummingbirds are visiting which flower species. You can even put a camera on a small object, a mushroom, and get time lapse. Tell it to take a picture every 30 seconds for 2 days. Time lapse of a mushroom growing. What's eating your corn? And I joke on the last one, but if you want to know what time your teenager came home at night, just saying. I'm going to end probably with this. Another interesting one is this project run by the University of Minnesota. They have been putting cameras at sites that deer gut piles that hunters leave in the woods and learning a lot from that. So you can go to that, maybe even participate in it and learn more about it. And I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
John, thank you so much for all that information. It's fascinating and a lot of things you don't think about when you just get a camera. I've done most of those mistakes probably in the past where I've had a camera and go try to stash it outside in public land and try to get some pictures or on a private property and trees moving and whatnot. So lots of good tips in there. I really appreciate you sharing that with us. So just putting a link to there's this project in the chat there. So if anybody does want to link to the whole full project, you can do that. I just put that in the chat. If anybody has any questions, either for John or if you have questions for Grace, she is in the audience today, so I could pull her up too to answer questions. So let's get one about ruffed grouse. Here, Luke asked, I hear ruffed grouse drumming in the woods by my house frequently, but I haven't been able to record one on my trail camera in 4-ish years that he's been putting one out. Would you recommend I increase the sensitivity of my camera and angle it downward facing the trail and having a better chance of catching a grouse on the video? What are other things I should consider?
Yeah, I think in general the sensitivity again the answer can vary depending upon the season, like I mentioned, but in general I think a rough grouse is big enough that it were in front of if it were at the location the camera was aiming, they're big enough and their movements are enough, they would trigger the camera. I got lots of pictures of pheasants on a study. We're doing another study now. We're not trying to monitor pheasants, but I had lots of pictures of pheasants coming through an area. So it may be more of a question of where's it best to put the camera. Rough grouse, I'm not the rough grouse biologist, but when they're drumming, they like to find big logs and objects. Putting a camera close to some of these big logs or things that you have in your forest that you think they might be on when they're drumming would be a good start. But yeah, it can be challenging to know where they're going to be, especially when they're drumming. Um, so try and find those objects in your forest that you think might be good drumming logs. They can drum in other places, but sometimes you got to find that focal point in order to increase your chances of catching them on an image. But I think the camera would normally trigger fine if the grouse was at the spot in front of the camera.
Interesting. Jason has a question. What do you recommend and what do you think works best for powering a camera? Lithium batteries or solar? Any suggestions there?
Yeah, I definitely think lithium batteries are better, especially better in the winter months during the cold months, but they just last longer at any time. I should note that a lot of cameras ask you to tell it in the programming what kind of batteries you have. It may adjust some things about the power on the camera. It'll ask you, are they lithium, alkaline, or the rechargeable? Nowadays, rechargeable is good. They're making, I think, lithium rechargeable batteries too. And by that, I mean like double A's. Some cellular cameras come with big battery packs that are recharged. They're not, 8 individual, double A batteries. They're battery packs, but many cameras are still, you put in 6 or 8, double A batteries. So lithium is better in my opinion, not always needed. Certainly they're more expensive. They're not gonna, or they're going to last longer. So there's a trade-off there. But I like lithium, especially in the cold months. Um, Consider the rechargeables, but over time, you're going to have to replace those. Their ability to keep recharging fades over time.
Great, good information. Bill has a question about bears. A bear clamped onto his camera this spring and punched out some of that plastic. He was wondering if you've ever tried to repair or use plastic to cover up those sensors again.
Yeah, it kind of depends. We have tried to repair some cameras ourselves. One of my previous assistants, did some tinkering at times. It kind of depends on where the puncture was. Did it break something that was related to the camera itself taking the picture? Was it the sensor, the passive infrared sensor cover? So what part of it was damaged? The best thing to do is just, of course, to tinker and put the camera out and walk in front of it. The camera will tell you whether it's, going to work, whatever fix you try to apply. I would also say we have sent cameras back to companies in the past who are willing to do some repairs or replacements on cameras. So that may vary. There may even be some, I don't know, out there now, there may be some secondary, just like cell phone, my glass is broken, there's secondary companies that might fix that. So it could be there's some companies out there that will do that, but you can check with the company that, that made the camera and see if they are willing to do any kinds of repairs.
That's a good suggestion. I don't see any other questions in there. So again, if you do have a question for John, or if you have a question for Grace about the OFL project, please reach out. I did put the link for that in there.
Since we have just a couple minutes, I might just mention one more quick thing. I was on a slide I skipped over. So another important thing to really think about is picture management, right? Cameras are great, but if you're trying to find where is that one cool bobcat picture that I want to show somebody? So Picture management can be really important. Some cameras, the company that you buy the camera from, sometimes have their own software for helping you manage pictures and your camera locations. But there are other free sites out there, some that use artificial intelligence to tell you what's in the picture. We are increasingly using that. Wildlife Insights is one example of a web platform. You can Google and find that. It's free to private individuals. You can upload your images, sign up for free, set up a project, upload your images. As the images are uploading, it tells you what it thinks is in every one and what confidence. Bobcat, wolf, deer, squirrel, gray squirrel. It's not perfect, but it's quite good. And it can be a way to learn more as well, educate yourself. And they manage the pictures. They store them all in the cloud. If I want to filter all my pictures to just see all the wolf ones, hey, there it is. And then I can download it, save it to my computer for something I want to show somebody. So there are some good third-party sites out there to help with identifying species and managing your pictures. Worth considering at least.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. That's one thing I still struggle with is picture management. We get a lot of pictures, and what do you do with them all? So I think with that, we're going to close the webinar down. I hope everybody can join us here in a couple of weeks. We're getting you, I guess, warmed up for the Halloween season. We're going to talk about lampreys, kind of one of the goriest fish, I guess, we have in Minnesota. Lampreys in Minnesota. So Corey and Brett are going to be joining us to talk about that. So hope everybody has a safe and enjoyable couple weeks. Get outside. There's some hunting seasons open. I know pheasant opener is this coming weekend. Get outside, introduce somebody new to the outdoors, and have a wonderful and safe couple weeks. We'll talk to you next time.